Richard Montgomery was one of the most respected lawyers in the city. He had built a strong reputation over the years, winning high-profile cases and earning the trust of powerful clients. His confidence was unmatched, and many saw him as an unstoppable force in the courtroom. But behind his success, Richard held a belief that few people knew about. He didn't respect black professionals. He never said it out loud, but his actions made it clear. When given the choice, he avoided working with black lawyers. He dismissed black clients who couldn't pay top dollar. He even made sure he never had a black law partner. In his mind, they didn't belong in the same league as him. Despite this, Richard was careful. He knew how to act in public. He never said anything offensive outright. He kept his real thoughts hidden behind a mask of professionalism. It was easy for him. He had done it for years. People admired Richard for his legal skills, but those who worked closely with him noticed his attitude. He treated black colleagues differently, interrupting them in meetings, ignoring their suggestions, and refusing to acknowledge their achievements. Yet, no one ever confronted him. He was too powerful. Richard believed he was untouchable. He thought his actions would never have consequences. But everything was about to change. A new case was coming his way, one that would put him face to face with someone he had no respect for. And this time, the world would be watching. Richard didn't know it yet, but his life was about to take a turn. A wealthy businessman named Charles Whitman had been accused of fraud. The case was all over the news, and Charles needed the best defense attorney money could buy. Naturally, he hired Richard. Richard welcomed the challenge. He had won dozens of cases like this before. He studied the evidence, built his arguments, and planned his strategy. He was confident that victory was within reach. But then he received news that made him pause. The trial had been assigned to Judge Carter. Judge Carter was one of the most respected judges in the city. He was known for being fair, intelligent, and strict in the courtroom. But to Richard, none of that mattered. Judge Carter was black. Richard felt a wave of irritation. He had never argued a case in front of Judge Carter before, and he didn't like the idea of doing it now. He didn't trust black professionals, and he certainly didn't want one deciding his case. For a brief moment, he considered asking for a different judge, but he knew that would raise suspicions. Instead, he kept his thoughts to himself and pretended everything was fine. This doesn't change anything, he told himself. I'll still win. But deep down, something bothered him. He had always been able to control the courtroom, manipulating judges with his words and confidence. Would that work on Judge Carter? Richard brushed the thought away. He was Richard Montgomery. He had never lost a case, and he wasn't about to start now. With a smirk, he straightened his tie and prepared for trial. He had no idea that his arrogance was about to cost him everything. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, legal experts, and curious spectators filled the seats, eager to witness the high-profile trial. Cameras flashed as Richard Montgomery entered with his usual confidence. He walked to his table, straightened his suit, and smirked. He was in control. At least, that's what he thought. At the front of the courtroom, Judge Carter took his seat. He adjusted his glasses and surveyed the room with calm authority. His presence commanded respect. Richard felt a flash of irritation. He had argued before dozens of judges, but something about Judge Carter made him uneasy. Maybe it was the judge's reputation for fairness. Maybe it was the way he carried himself with dignity. Or maybe, deep down, Richard simply couldn't stand the idea of answering to a black man. The trial began. Richard delivered his opening statement with practiced ease, weaving a story meant to persuade the jury. But Judge Carter remained unreadable. His expression neutral. He wasn't easily swayed. As the prosecution presented their case, Richard started showing his true colors. He interrupted witnesses. He objected unnecessarily. He spoke over the judge. Each time, Judge Carter calmly corrected him, reminding him of court procedures. Richard didn't like that. He was used to getting his way, and he wasn't used to a judge pushing back. The tension grew. At one point, Richard rolled his eyes as Judge Carter made a ruling. The courtroom fell silent. A few people exchanged glances, sensing the disrespect, but Judge Carter ignored the gesture and moved on. Then Richard did something worse. During cross-examination, he raised his voice at a black witness, dismissing their words as irrelevant. Judge Carter immediately intervened. "Mr. Montgomery, Please remain professional. Richard clenched his jaw. He wanted to argue, but something in Judge Carter's tone stopped him. It wasn't anger. It wasn't frustration. It was something far worse, complete control. Judge Carter wasn't rattled. He wasn't intimidated. Richard hated that. As the trial continued, it became clear that Judge Carter would not tolerate disrespect. He maintained order with steady authority, refusing to let Richard take over the courtroom. For the first time in his career, Richard felt powerless. The trial had been intense, but Judge Carter handled every moment with calm professionalism. Richard, on the other hand, was growing more frustrated by the day. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially by someone he didn't respect. Finally, after a long and exhausting court session, Judge Carter stood from his seat. The session had ended for the day. Lawyers from both sides gathered their documents, preparing to leave. Then, Judge Carter did something unexpected. He walked toward Richard and extended his hand. His face remained neutral, his tone steady. "Good work today, Mr. Montgomery." The courtroom fell silent. Richard looked down at the judge's hand. A handshake. A simple, professional gesture. But in Richard's mind, it felt like something else. It felt like being put on the same level as a black man. And that, he couldn't accept. Without a word, Richard turned away. He grabbed his briefcase and walked off, completely ignoring the judge's hand. A low murmur spread through the room. People had seen it. Lawyers, journalists, court staff. Everyone noticed the blatant disrespect. A few whispered to each other. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Judge Carter, however, showed no reaction. He calmly withdrew his hand, adjusted his robe, and walked away as if nothing had happened. But the damage was done. Richard may not have realized it in that moment, but he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. Richard left the courtroom without a second thought. In his mind, the moment was insignificant. He had no regrets. He had won cases before, and he would win again. That was all that mattered. But outside the courtroom, the world was already talking. By the next morning, news of his actions had spread like wildfire. Lawyers who had been present in the courtroom shared what they saw. Journalists picked up the story, and soon, headlines appeared everywhere. Top lawyer disrespects black judge in shocking courtroom incident. Attorney Richard Montgomery refuses to shake judge's hand, sparks outrage. Social media exploded with discussions. People shared their opinions, and most of them weren't on Richard's side. Disgusting behavior. How does someone like this still have a job? This is exactly what's wrong with the system. At first, Richard ignored the noise. He scoffed at the articles and dismissed the comments. "People are too sensitive these days," he muttered. "This will blow over." But it didn't. Within days, his law firm's phones were ringing non-stop. Clients were calling, some demanding answers, others canceling their contracts. Prominent figures in the legal field spoke out against him. Even lawyers who once respected him distanced themselves. The pressure kept growing. Then, Richard received an unexpected call from the senior partners at his firm. "We need to talk," they said. Richard arrived at the firm's office, expecting a minor discussion. But the moment he stepped inside, he realized this was serious. The partners sat across from him, their expressions tense. "We've had multiple complaints," one of them said. "We're losing clients," another added. "This is bad for the firm's reputation." Richard leaned back, arms crossed. "So what? It's just online outrage. It'll pass." But the firm's senior partner shook his head. "No, Richard, this is different. This time people aren't forgetting." For the first time, doubt crept into Richard's mind. He had been untouchable for so long. But now, it seemed like that was changing, and for the first time, he started to wonder if he had made a mistake. Richard sat in the firm's conference room, staring at the senior partners. He had always been the one in control, the one calling the shots. But now, the power had shifted. "We're suspending you," one of the partners said firmly. Richard's eyes narrowed. "Suspending me? Over a handshake?" "This isn't just about the handshake," another partner replied. "It's about how the world sees you now. Clients don't want to be associated with you. The firm is taking a hit." Richard scoffed. "This is ridiculous. I built my career on winning cases, not on shaking hands." The senior partner leaned forward. "You don't get it, do you? It's not just about winning cases anymore. Reputation matters." Richard clenched his jaw. For years he had believed his skills alone would keep him on top. Now, he was seeing the truth. "We've already released a statement condemning your actions," one of the partners added. "If you want any chance of keeping your career, you need to apologize." Richard's pride flared. Apologize? To a black judge? The very thought made his stomach turn. "No," he said flatly. "I'm not apologizing." A heavy silence filled the room. The partners exchanged looks before one of them spoke. "Then we have no choice. Your suspension stands. And if this gets worse, we may be forced to take further action." Richard stood abruptly, gripping his briefcase. "Do whatever you have to do," he muttered before storming out. As he walked through the firm's hallways, he noticed something strange. People weren't greeting him like before. Colleagues avoided eye contact. Conversations quieted when he passed. For the first time, Richard felt something unfamiliar. Isolation. Days turned into weeks, and Richard's world continued to fall apart. Clients kept dropping him. Some sent emails, politely stating they were going in a different direction. Others didn't bother with an explanation. They just left. His calendar, once filled with high-profile cases, was now empty. At first, Richard told himself it was temporary. "They'll come back," he muttered. "They need me." But they didn't. The law firm that once valued him now treated him like an outsider. His suspension meant he had no cases to work on, no meetings to attend. Colleagues he had worked with for years kept their distance. No more greetings in the hallway, no more invitations to lunch. It was as if he didn't exist. Even his personal life took a hit. Friends stopped calling, some avoided him entirely. The few who did reach out only wanted to know one thing. "Are you going to apologize?" Richard refused. But as he sat alone in his expensive office staring at a phone that never rang, doubt crept in. Had he really lost everything over a handshake? No. It wasn't the handshake. It was what it represented. The world had changed, and Richard had refused to change with it. And now, he was paying the price. Richard had always believed that his success would protect him. That no matter what happened, his reputation as a top lawyer would keep him on top. But now, sitting alone in his office, he realized how wrong he had been. His phone barely rang. His emails were mostly from news outlets asking for a statement, something he had no interest in giving. His law firm had distanced itself, and his clients had moved on. For the first time in his career, Richard felt powerless. Desperation crept in. He needed to fix this. But how? He thought about reaching out to former clients, but he knew they wouldn't take his calls. He thought about making a public statement, but what would he even say? Then, for the first time since the incident, Richard considered something he had never thought possible. An apology. It wasn't an easy decision. His pride fought against it. But the truth was clear. His career was crumbling, and the only way to stop it was to take responsibility. So he made the call. Judge Carter answered after a few rings. His voice was calm, as always. "Mr. Montgomery." Richard swallowed his pride. "Judge Carter, I wanted to say I was wrong." The words felt foreign in his mouth. "I disrespected you and I shouldn't have. He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I'm sorry." There was a brief silence before Judge Carter replied. "I appreciate the call, Mr. Montgomery, but respect isn't about words, it's about actions." Richard felt a sting. He had expected a simple acceptance, maybe even some reassurance. Instead, Judge Carter's words made it clear. One apology wouldn't fix everything, and he was right. So, Richard did something he never thought he would do. He signed up for diversity and sensitivity programs, not because the firm forced him, but because he wanted to understand why the world had turned against him. It wasn't easy. Listening to people's experiences, hearing how prejudice had affected their careers, and realizing he had been part of the problem, it was uncomfortable. But for the first time in his life, Richard actually listened. Months passed. Slowly, things started to change. His law firm reinstated him, but clients were hesitant. His reputation was damaged, and trust wasn't easy to rebuild. Richard had spent years believing he was above consequences. Now, he understood that respect had to be earned, and for the first time in his life, he was willing to try.